Cameras are rolling. Rolling.
Sound speeding.
The time has come for our celebration of cinema's classic, Real Monsters!
Hello everyone, I bid you welcome to episode 2 of Real Monsters Podcast. I'm your host, AJ Danna, and I'm grateful you're tuning in. Thanks for joining me today. Previously on Real Monsters Podcast, I interviewed Jacob Larson about the history of classic monster pinball machines. Today, my guest is Craig Sawyer, the writer and creator of Forbidden Museum, a new classic monster-inspired comic series. Forbidden Museum takes some familiar elements of the classic monster lore and ties them into a sort of Indiana Jones sense of adventure, presenting a fresh take on the Monster of the Week format. We're following along with Henry Harker, a direct descendant of Jonathan Harker, as he traverses the globe looking for cursed artifacts and prime evils that plague the world. We'll talk to Craig Sawyer all about it in just a moment, but first, as you might know, I secretly invite each of my Real Monsters podcast guests to start their interview with their best mad scientist laugh to keep the cheesy Halloween and horror vibe going. So, without further ado, please welcome to Real Monsters Podcast, Craig Sawyer! Wow, bravo! That is by far the best mad scientist laugh we have had so far on Real Monsters Podcast. Even though there's only a handful of episodes, that's the front runner. Everybody else is going to have to beat that one. Well done, sir.
The bar is set.
The bar is indeed set. And of course, it makes sense because you are a monster creator, writer and creator of Forbidden Museum, a new comic book series. At the time of this recording, you just successfully funded issue number 2 on Kickstarter. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
So as I mentioned in the introduction, this is a story that sort of blends archaeology with the classic monsters by spawning one of Harker's direct descendants from the Dracula story and turns him into sort of an adventurer character. Tell us a little bit more about Forbidden Museum and how you got the idea for this story.
So you're absolutely right. So you go back and in the normal Bram Stoker's Dracula, Jonathan Harker, the Hunters of Dracula, Jonathan Harker, Mina Harker, Quincy Morris, and Dr. Van Helsing that we all know from the books and some of the movies. In my world, they trap Dracula in his coffin and they seal it with this forbidden magic from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. So what do you do when you trap this great evil, one of many great evils in the world, a Forbidden Museum? Well, you build a magical prison for him. And not only does Dracula exist in my world, but also the Gill God, the Mummy King, the Wolf Beast, and Frankenstein's monster. So Jonathan Harker and crew hunt these prime evils down, and they lock them away in this magical prison he calls the Forbidden Museum, which is located about a mile under the British Museum in London. And there he seals it with this powerful artifact, the Book of the Dead. Flash forward to present day, and his maybe great grandson, Henry Harker, is an amateur podcaster, adventurer, and he's been searching for his grandfather's Forbidden Museum, thinking it holds priceless antiquities, and he'll be super famous for it. But what he finds is this magical prison of monsters that he accidentally releases and becomes this cursed curator who is slowly rotting until he can find all these prime evils and replace them back in the museum.
Excellent. And we're already seeing some of that story in issue number 1, which is also beautiful, by the way. Luke Archie did the interior pencils and inks, James G. Brown did the colors, and Ed Dukeshire did the letters. But issue number 1 is really interesting because this essentially introduces us to how Henry Harker became the cursed curator of the Forbidden Museum in the present day. And issue number 2, which was just successfully funded, it focuses on the Temple of the Gill God. Tell us about that.
So the Gill Gods, some of the things in the museum are artifacts of some of their actual monsters. So the egg of the Gill God got stolen. Henry Harker had a partner named Malcolm who betrayed Henry Harker and locked him in a sarcophagus and stole all the items and sold them on the black market, which is why they're scattered across the globe. So Henry Harker has this magical scarab that attaches itself to the new curator's chest, which he is, and gives him the strength of 10 men. He doesn't have to breathe, sleep, or eat. So it sounds all great at first until you realize you're slowly rotting, and it's actually a curse. So he's becoming a cursed monster himself. So it kind of gives him this vibe of where to find these items. So it's almost like a GPS tracker. So he knows the next item he needs to find is in the Amazon. So he he gets a plane using he also has his great grandfather's, all his money. He's got all this money, and he flies down to find the egg, and he's got to locate each one. So each issue of the comic will be a different monster that he has to hunt down or artifact.
See, I totally love that format because you've got a monster of the week set up here with these characters that are from myths and legends that lend themselves very well to these various environments that Henry Harker can be visiting. And I particularly enjoy the Gill God concept because when I was younger, I really enjoyed a TV show called Legends of the Hidden Temple. And fans of this show may recall the contestants had to venture through all the various haunted and treacherous rooms of a temple environment to find an artifact from history. But I don't recall them doing any monster-related artifacts. So the fact that this Forbidden Museum series exists, tracking down artifacts, it's something that definitely appealed to my nostalgia and probably will do so for people who grew up with the Hidden Temple series and other various productions like that. It's perfect, honestly. I love this setup. And speaking of my childhood, a lot of the monster things that I grew up enjoying were what influenced my career, both as a creator and as a writer and a creature performer. Tell us about your childhood, Craig. Were you a monster kid growing up? I mean, you're still a monster kid now, but tell us about that.
Oh, for sure. So I grew up in a small town in Middle Tennessee, where we have a lake and a high school and a few stores. And I think I had 3 channels on the TV. And of course, I saw Universal monster movies. And the first time I saw those images of those monsters, as well as Hammer Horror, the British monsters like Oliver Reed and Curse of the Werewolf, was in the pages of an old, the Crestwood horror books. I don't know if you know about them, but my grammar school library had these set of orange-bound Crestwood monster books. And the covers were black and white imagery from the Hammer horror movies and from the Universal movies. And when I was in the 4th grade, only 6th graders could check these books out. So I begged the librarian if I could check these books out. And so I got all of them, and before I got to see the movies, it instilled this fascination for these images of like King Kong and the Mummy, Wolfman, and all these creatures that just stayed with me so much. That was how I started like my obsession with monsters. And there was actually a book in the library too, as well. It was a book on werewolves that literally taught you how to transform into one. And when you're in the 4th grade, you believe things are real, and like it involved like a wolfskin belt. But now that I look back, it was like, what are the ingredients of the spell that turned into a werewolf was poppy seeds, which I think is opium.
Oh no!
Yeah, I guess you would think you're a werewolf, but yeah, man, I grew up in the 80s, as like a 12 to early teen. Now, I mean, even my bus driver sold like the spike wristbands and butterfly knives. It was a different age, man. But my parents was cool later on about me watching horror movies. And for some reason, I've always been drawn to like monsters. It's just, I don't know if this is the outsider quality of monsters or just the extreme appearance of monsters. But yeah, from a young age, definitely a monster fan.
Well, you and me both, my friend. I recall reading an early copy of Edward Edelson's Great Monsters of the Movies. I found this little paperback for 75 cents when I was probably no older than 6 years old. And, seeing Nosferatu and Lon Chaney's Phantom of the Opera in these pages, you're right, it is that outsider quality to these characters. They're not the sort of characters we're seeing in our day-to-day lives, and not even really what we're seeing in the movies that are being made nowadays, which is why I appreciate creators like yourself who are still making these monster stories. So you mentioned that your parents were cool with you watching horror movies, which is great, a great way to get into the genre. Do you recall what your first monster movie was? There's
distinctly remember so 2 things that really influenced me as a child. One was a film and one was a TV movie. The film was Jaws, which I consider Jaws a horror movie per se. And I remember my mom, she was raised me as a single mom for the first 6 years of my life. And I think I was like 2.5 or 3. I barely remember this, but she took me to see to the movies to see Jaws. And I remember this because it was storming outside. And right when the music, the Danna, the power went out in the theater.
Oh, wow.
And like, I remember that even as like being like 3 years old, like it really put a shock in my system. And now that I look back, I started thinking about some of the things we're going to talk about today is like, those kind of events really shape you growing up. And I think it kind of instilled that cinematic fantasy horror kind of like world in me at a young age. And the TV movie I was talking about, there was an old movie based on H.G. Wells' The Island of Lost Souls. It was the Island of Dr. Moreau. There's a couple of islands of Dr. Moreau's that were made. There's the old one from the 20s and 30s. Then there's one in the 80s that had Burt Lancaster in it and Nigel Davenport, which is the one I saw on television, where the monsters are just terrifying. The hybrid monsters, just like, and they were very sympathetic too in that. And then later we have the Brando and the Val Kilmer version, which was just a train wreck. Then we'll talk about that too. There's a documentary on that called the Island of Lost Souls about the director who went insane because he got fired from that. But you got to check that out. But that's another story. But this Burt Lancaster version of Island of Dr. Moreau is like, I think I was probably maybe 4 or 5 or 6, but it came on television. And like the monsters on it just like blew my mind. And I really remember that movie as one of the first kind of like monster movies I saw.
Yeah, it sounds to me like you had a lot of these formative experiences essentially before the age of 10. And when you do have monsters as part of your upbringing at that point in time, I mean, that really is an easy way for one of two things to happen. Either you're going to be completely turned off by the genre because it freaks you out, or it's going to freak you out in the best way possible, and then you're hooked on it. It becomes normal to you, It
wasn't really scary. It was more like there's something magical in the world. There's difference in the world. And like, there's this, a little bit of fear to it, but mostly just like wonderment, I guess is a better word. Like, there's something else out there that I don't know about. Like, what is this?
I completely agree with you. I think one of the reasons I enjoy being an actor and being a creator, much like yourself, is finding that magic and curating, so to speak, that magic as opposed to what we see in our day-to-day lives. And I think that's something that makes the Forbidden Museum story also stand out, is you've got this character like Henry Harker who is so deeply rooted in what is material and what is now. He's a podcaster, he's an adventurer, an urban explorer, so to speak, and then he's introduced to these supernatural powers that obviously his relatives and his relatives' associates were quite familiar with, but is something that, correct me if I'm wrong, but Henry Harker in the beginning is sort of like a skeptic, wouldn't you say?
I mean, yeah. I mean, he has no idea that there's this underbelly of a magical monster-filled world. He was more like getting hits on his podcast kind of guy. And like, although he likes adventure and stuff, I don't think it ever entered his mind that this could be there could be a supernatural component to his grandfather's museum.
Well, boy, he was in for a rude awakening there.
Absolutely. But yeah, he's definitely the eyes of a modern audience seeing these monsters, and being introduced to these monsters and that. And what I love about, a genre of movies that I don't see much anymore. There's like a void of like, and everybody says, I love Indiana Jones. I love the monster movie. Most people love these movies. They love adventure movies, but you don't see too many of them anymore. I mean, there's a lot. I love the comic book movies, but I feel like the classic monsters are going to make, like they're right on the verge of making a comeback into the public consciousness. Very close.
I completely agree. I was just talking about this with my guest on the podcast in the last episode, Jacob Larson. We were discussing how events like Halloween Horror Nights at Universal have really helped bring the monsters back into the mainstream with their series of attractions like The Bride of Frankenstein Lives and Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman. These theme park attractions have, I think, really helped with the brand awareness in the general public eye when you see classic monsters advertised right alongside, modern franchises like Jurassic World and Fast and Furious. It really reminds you that in many ways we wouldn't be where we are today without these movies of yesteryear.
Absolutely. And Forbidden Museum was born of the fact that like I was waiting and waiting for Universal to kind of come up with fix their dark universe, and then I started thinking like, why is this not working, and what would I do if I had the reins to make my own monster filled universe? How would I do that? So what started as a thought experiment was like, you know what, I'm going to make a comic book and get this out of my system, and the Forbidden Museum was born from that.
And I'm really glad it was, because you picked a great format to showcase this essentially multiverse of monsters and have them all tied together in a way that works very well in a linear series like a comic book, because you have the opportunity to sort of introduce a different monster in each issue and explore their environments, which is another interesting opportunity you had here, because using these classic monsters of mythology and folklore, you've sort of expanded the world that each of them comes from with their own environments, like the Temple of the Gill God. Where was your thought process going when you were looking for inspiration to expand each of these environments the monsters come from? You've got the Temple of the Gill God and the Wolf Beast, and it was sort of up to you to draw upon familiar stories but create new elements for these monsters' homelands and environments. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I just feel like, what would I want to know more about these monsters? You like build more of a cohesive world for them and a backstory, and I take full advantage of adventure, humor, and the horror aspect of it. I wanted to give a full course meal. I think the Mummy series with Brendan Fraser did humor well. I think Universal's version did casting the monsters and the atmosphere well. Hammer Horror did the over-the-top blood and sexy horror well, and the novels had things in them that were never added to the mythos in general. Like, many people don't realize that love Dracula. I don't think they've ever read Bram Stoker's Dracula, because Dracula in that book was a black magician who sought out this magic school in the Carpathians that was actually ran by Satan himself, and he became the most adept student of evil, and he was literally a necromancer that turned himself into a vampire. That's in Bram Stoker's Dracula. There's more to this character that hasn't been done, and I kind of want to re-envision those things. And there's a quote from the creator of the movie Alien, Dan O'Bannon, that goes, "I didn't steal from anybody. I stole from everybody." I'm not talking like plagiarism. I'm talking about nothing's new under the sun. Everybody takes something that's come before them and puts their own imagination into the soup and creates something new from that. Dracula in my world is a dark wizard, magician, necromancer who stole Vlad Tepes's identity and castle, and he seeks power. And so Frankenstein in my world shares a brain with Dr. Frankenstein and the monster. And so he's literally both of them. So now you can actually call Dr. Frankenstein's monster Frankenstein, because he is, and they share a consciousness in my book. And the Gill God is worshipped as a god in the Amazon by a particular tribe. And I added more of a prehistoric Lost World element to the Amazon, where there's more dinosaurs in it, and he's a throwback to prehistoric times. So there's going to be a dinosaur battle with the Gill God. And the Wolf Beast is a thief from New Orleans who steals a cursed wolf belt made of wolf skin, and he finds himself cursed as the new Wolf Beast. So I'm trying to put a spin on all these and give each story like its own identity that we haven't seen before. Exactly.
Well, I think it's working. Just reading the books so far, it's got its own original identity that still feels rooted in mythology and folklore and some elements of the original novels and certain things borrowed here and there to create your own original vision of these characters, which I really appreciate, and it comes across very clearly, and it's a really enjoyable read. I recommend everybody out there check out issue number 1 if you haven't yet. I believe you said issue number 1 had a sold-out run. Is that correct?
Yeah, we had two sold-out runs for issue 1.
Well, thank you for playing your part in helping get classic monsters back onto comic book stands and hopefully into young hands very soon. But Forbidden Museum is not the only project you're working on. Tell us what's next for you, Craig.
Hey, I'm glad you asked. I have the artist finishing up issue 2 of Forbidden Museum, which should be out in July. And I also just wrapped up my debut novel. It's a horror story. It's called The Clayboy, and then it's out to a few publishers. And I'll have a very creepy short story called The Bone King, being published by Quill and Crow Publishing in the anthology Carnival Macabre, Gothic Horror. So it's a story of a group of modern day train hoppers encountering the terrifying folk legend known as the Bone King. So please check that out. The anthology will be available in May. You can find it at quillandcrowpublishinghouse.com.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading those, and I hope some of our listeners today are going to look into those as well, and Forbidden Museum. So for anyone looking to learn more about your work, where can they find you online?
You can find me on Insta and Twitter at C Sawyer Writer. You can also email me directly at info@skulldustpress@gmail.com. info@skulldustpress@gmail.com.
Alrighty, thank you, Craig, and thank you to all of you for listening to today's episode of Real Monsters Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I hope you enjoy reading Forbidden Museum. That wraps up today's interview, so keep it real, monster fans. I'm AJ Danna, and I'll see you next time for more Real Monsters Podcast. Real Monsters Podcast theme song by Alexander Taylor. Real Monsters logo and key art by Will Davenport. Real Monsters Podcast is an unofficial fan tribute to the classic monster stories of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, and is not sponsored by any of the entertainment entities discussed. Any and all opinions expressed within Real Monsters Podcast are those of my own or those of my guests. Stay tuned and subscribe to Real Monsters Podcast for even more monstrous discussions.